Hello, everyone. My name is Hannah Barabee, and it is my pleasure to have the opportunity to present once again for the 2025 Able Assembly. I have long blonde hair, and I'm wearing a blue patterned dress, a black cardigan, and light blue earrings. I've had the honor of presenting work previously for the Assembly, but I'm looking especially forward to the topic of today's presentation, which is using children's literature in the anti-ableist arts classroom. We will start with a brief introduction to anti-ableist arts pedagogy, as well as a practical guide to choosing and critiquing literature, and then dive into 3 different ways of using children's literature in our arts classrooms. There will also be a handout with resources and a written guide to accompany this presentation. Our focus today is a very small but very important piece of a much larger topic, which is anti-ableism in the arts. The short version is that it is crucial for children to be interacting with disabled and neurodivergent peers. And unfortunately, in today's model of special education, there's very little opportunity for those interactions to occur outside of arts classrooms and elementary arts classrooms in particular. The positive side of this is that the arts uniquely facilitate the kinds of interactions that are conducive to children of all abilities developing a healthy attitude and understanding of disability and neurodiversity. If you're interested in taking steps to begin your own anti-ableist arts pedagogy journey, you can check out the linked post I wrote for the Berkeley Institute for Accessible Arts Education's Able Snapshots, which will give you some ideas about what this might look like in your teaching context. Looking through the scholarship on how children interact with literature gives credence to the idea that books are one of the most important and most magical tools we can bring into our teaching. We know that reading provides opportunities for children to look through windows and mirrors, meaning to see themselves reflected in the text and illustrations, but also to look outside of their experience into the wider world around them. Bishop expanded upon this idea to include sliding glass doors to suggest that children are not limited to merely looking within or just outside their reality, but that literature allows children to temporarily become part of the world of the book. That momentary transportation allows children to reflect on their own identities within the spectrum of human diversity and experience. Unfortunately, children's literature often contains problematic narratives of disability that distance children from individuals with disability by presenting incomplete, deficit-based, or underdeveloped portrayals of disabled and neurodivergent characters. Although children's literature has evolved considerably, we still have a long way to go with regard to disability. These 4 images are taken from a really wonderful series of children's books called The Questionnaires that has done a great job of making sure that there are diverse characters whose differences in culture and upbringing, and in one case, a protagonist's learning disability, are portrayed in a positive light. Still, disability is largely missing as an element of human diversity in the world of the questionnaires. The teacher, Lila Greer, gets a busy and dynamic cast of students each year in her classroom alongside each of the protagonists in the series. However, as the children play, learn, and explore, visibly disabled children are noticeably absent from the classroom environment. One student uses a cochlear implant and another uses a wheelchair, but she's only present outside of the classroom at a protest in the community. Unfortunately, the demographics of Lila Greer's fictional classroom reflect the reality that children with disabilities often spend much, if not most, of their day outside of their classroom community. There are countless frameworks we can use to critically examine children's literature in this way, but the criteria that I have chosen as a starting point comes from the book Anti-Bias Education for Young Children and Ourselves by Louise Derman-Sparks and Julie Edwards. It is an absolutely fabulous resource that lives on my desk and that I reference frequently when I come to an impasse about a particular text or difficult situation in my classroom. They state that any book you choose needs to be well-written, age-appropriate, and compelling. No matter how important the message is, if it isn't a book that will interest young children, keep looking. Other guidelines that I find ring true in my classroom are that it's important to balance fiction and nonfiction texts, to look for books that contain themes of kindness, problem solving, and collaboration across experiences and identities. It is also important to make sure that the characters and situations in the book are representative of a wide range of identities and experiences. And finally, choose texts that are pertinent to your classroom and community. When I'm selecting literature through the lens of anti-ableism, I seek out texts that provide windows, mirrors, and sliding glass doors, but also ramps. And what I mean by this is opportunities for children to not just think critically about disability, but to actively engage in the work of accessibility. I look for characters and storylines that present narratives rooted in the social, biopsychosocial, affirmation, and identity models of disability that rely on first-person accounts and collaborations, that recognize intersectional identities, and that balance shared experience and community with individual experiences and identities. I try to avoid texts that present disability as something to be cured or overcome, that present a disabled character in a sidekick role or as lacking agency, or books in which disabled children are the subject of wonder, pity, inspiration, or other forms of objectification. As you go about choosing anti-ableist literature for your learning community, remember that children are capable of asking and exploring big questions. Derman, Sparks, and Edwards go more into the potential pitfalls of misrepresentation, but I think tokenism is a big one to avoid. Make sure that you don't have just one text about disability, just one text about deaf culture, etc. They should be part of a larger selection of materials and resources that present a broader and more diverse representation of disability and impairment. And they should be part of a curriculum in which anti-ableism and other forms of anti-bias perspectives are constant, not just a quick stop along the way. Be sure to plan enough time for appropriately guided discussion and reflection on the subject matter. Make sure to continue to do your own self-reflection and growth around ableism. And finally, remember that no text is perfect. Unfortunately, there's a real dearth of children's books about disability, neurodiversity, and impairment. And so while it's important to stay critical and make sure that the texts that we are presenting are just and accurate, it is not possible to find one that meets all the criteria for just narrative and representation. The beautiful thing about using literature in the arts classroom is that the arts end up being the perfect lens to critique and to reimagine. As you come across something with your students that doesn't feel quite accurate or just, use the arts to ask what you could do to create a more just representation. What resources would we have to turn to? What could we have done differently if we had written or illustrated this book? One of my all-time favorite children's books is Just Ask by Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, illustrated by Rafael Lopez. I used this book in a week-long community arts project in collaboration with Multi-Arts, a wonderful community arts organization for children here in Western Massachusetts. The book presents the idea of interdependence through a group of children who are working together to create a garden. Just as each plant needs different conditions to thrive and serves a different purpose, so too do people. And when we can all work together to meet one another's needs, we thrive as a community. On each page, a child introduces themselves with their interests, their likes and dislikes, and their individual experience of disability or neurodivergence. There are multiple characters with different experiences of the same disability, highlighting the idea that disability is unique to each person. Each child in the book asks a question of the readers, encouraging discussion and signaling that disability and neurodiversity can be discussed openly and without taboo. The text both normalizes and celebrates disability and neurodivergence and promotes the idea that accessibility is a communal responsibility. We began by reading the book, allowing plenty of time for developmentally appropriate discussion. Each child then received a journal, and we pretended to be botanists who were discovering previously unidentified plants. They had time to sketch, to consider growing conditions and the needs of their plants. For the rest of the week, we worked on creating three-dimensional versions of these plants using a base of terracotta pots, paint, and various recycled materials. Although the product of this project was really beautiful, and you can see some examples of those here on the left, it really was the conversations that the children had with me and amongst themselves that were so special. Many children opened up about not feeling like their school environment was neuroaffirming. They talked about feeling different or out of place at school, and they found friendship and solidarity in peers with similar experiences. On the last day of the workshop, we had a culminating garden party, which began informally with the children exploring and showing one another their plants. many chose to present their plant to the whole group. Some of the plants were very silly and needed things like pizza or gaming to thrive. But there were also some incredible conversations that happened, and children that I wasn't expecting to present gave very personal and meaningful descriptions of how their plants reflected their identity, sparking honest conversations and solidarity around neurodiversity, especially. Listen is another wonderful book by Shannon Stalker, illustrated by Devon Halsworth, about the life of deaf percussionist Dame Evelyn Gleaney. I used this book in a cross-curricular unit on sound and deaf culture with second grade who have just learned about the science of sound in their science classes. This book is not a perfect text. It was written with some degree of collaboration with Gleaney, but even so, one of the things that I don't love about it is that it presents deafness through the lens of loss and sadness. And there's nothing wrong with that because that is some people's experience, but I don't want it to be the first or only narrative my hearing students have of deafness. One of the things we can do to navigate an imperfect text is to ask questions and allow students to discuss. I make sure to explain that this is just one experience and that deaf culture is a diverse, proud, and vibrant culture and community. Part of how we portray that is by bringing in accompanying text and materials. I also show a video in which Gleaney discusses and demonstrates how she feels sound, as well as an ASL interpreted version of the book Moses Goes to a Concert, about a group of children from a school for the deaf and hard of hearing who attend a concert. We then use Gleaney and Moses's methods of feeling and visualizing sound to play classroom instruments and stations. It is so exciting to see my students not only rediscovering all of these instruments, but also discovering what their bodies are capable of through this lens. Students come away with a deeper understanding of the science of sound, as well as new ways of using their other senses to make music. Children also develop a deeper multi-sensory understanding of musical concepts. At the end of this unit, I ask my students to reflect on the listen text, and I ask them, what is the central problem of this story? They identify that the problem is not Gleaney's deafness, but the attitudes and lack of imagination of the judges who initially rejected her from the Royal Academy of Music with the belief that a deaf person could not possibly be a professional musician. We then have a discussion around bias, around what it feels like to be rejected, and what we can do to counter those biases. The final text is one that we will certainly be familiar to any early childhood educators out there. We're Going on a Bear Hunt by Michael Rosen, illustrated by Helen Oxenberry. This story is not explicitly about disability or accessibility, but rather one in which I use anti-ableism and accessibility as a lens into the text. I typically use this book in kindergarten, but I've done it with preschool groups as well. At that age, children are learning about their five senses, as well as prepositions and describing location and proximity. In music, we're exploring ostinato, steady beat, chant, form, and of course, at that age, we need to keep them moving. So this is a great text to facilitate all of those things. I created a tactile version of the story using Play-Doh for the mud, soft artificial snowballs, which I put in the refrigerator for the snowstorm, a grass skirt for the tall, wavy grass, a silk scarf for the river, and a spooky cave under a table with a teddy bear hiding inside. After having read the text and moving to a steady beat while chanting the refrain, we create our own bear hunt adventure. You can see the setup in the image to the right. It isn't anything fancy, but the children think it's magical just the same. Before we go on the adventure together, I ask them how we can make sure that all of our friends can go on this adventure. And it ends up being an exercise in using our collective creative thinking to make our adventure accessible. I prompt the children to think about accessibility by asking questions like, how can somebody who uses a wheelchair navigate the river? And although students often have very elaborate ideas, I ask them to limit their solutions to what we have around the room. A simple solution they have come up with is to build a dam using rhythm sticks. Children love this activity and they come away with an understanding that accessibility is everyone's responsibility and that it's also an exciting and important thing to do as a community. Another interesting takeaway that I didn't anticipate with this adventure is that children learn to see disability and impairment as variations in human experience and identity that are assets to our community. I've had students who suggest that if we had a student who used a cane or a service animal, maybe they could use those things to help us find out what's inside the cave. Or they have the idea that when we're moving through the tall, wavy grass, if someone used a wheelchair, they could lead the group and that would push down the grass to make it easier for all of us to get through. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen, and I really hope that you're coming away excited to bring anti-ableist children's literature into your art space. I'm including a handout with the title Anti-Ableist Children's Literature for the Arts Classroom, which includes a list of suggested texts and other resources you might find useful. Enjoy the rest of the 2025 Able Assembly, and please do reach out if you have any questions, ideas, or just want to talk about anti-ableism in the arts.